We now know how to form a corporation, that is, through the process of incorporation. The next question is, who may form a corporation? Who may go through the process of incorporation we just discussed? Corporations are formed by persons called incorporators. They are the first and original owners of the corporation. They are the ones who go through the process of incorporation. They come up with the name of the corporation, raise the capital, and prepare and sign the articles of incorporation and bylaws which are submitted to the SEC. Who can be incorporators? Incorporators can either be natural persons or artificial persons. Natural persons are human beings just like you and me. To be an incorporator, a natural person must be of legal age, that is, at least 18 years old. Artificial persons refer to organizations such as partnerships, associations, and other corporations. To be an incorporator, an artificial person must be registered with the SEC. However, a corporation registered in another country, called a foreign corporation, can also be an incorporator. How many are the incorporators? There can be 1 to 15 incorporators, so the minimum is 1 and the maximum is 15. Incorporators may be a mix of natural and artificial persons. If there is only one incorporator, the corporation is called a one-person corporation. We will have a special discussion on one-person corporations in a separate module. Are there other requirements to become an incorporator? The answer is yes. An incorporator must be an owner of at least one share of stock in the corporation. That means that the incorporator must be a shareholder in the corporation. We will discuss shareholders in a short while. You know already how to form a corporation, that is, through the process of incorporation, as well as who can form it, that is, the incorporators. Let us now discuss the ownership of a corporation. Who are the owners of a corporation? The owners of a corporation are called the shareholders. They are called such because they own shares of stock in the corporation. So how do you become a shareholder? Let us begin by understanding the capital structure of a corporation. Every corporation has an authorized capital stock. This is the total amount of capital that the corporation is authorized to raise. The authorized capital stock is stated in the Articles of Incorporation submitted for approval to the SEC during incorporation. The authorized capital stock is divided into smaller units called the shares of stock. Each share of stock has a corresponding value called the par value. So, the total number of shares of stock of a corporation multiplied by the par value equals the authorized capital stock. For example, the authorized capital stock of a corporation may be 1 million pesos. This amount may be divided into as many shares as the corporation prefers. For example, the 1 million authorized capital stock may be divided into 1 million shares with a par value of 1 peso per share. Or it may be divided into 100,000 shares with a par value of 10 pesos per share. To raise capital, the corporation offers its shares of stock to investors. When an investor buys shares of stock, he becomes an owner of the corporation. He is now called a shareholder. A share of stock therefore represents a unit of ownership in the corporation. The shareholder is issued a certificate to evidence his ownership of the number of shares bought. The certificate is called a certificate of stock. Now, who can buy shares of stock and become shareholders? A shareholder can either be a natural person or an artificial person. Remember our discussion a while back? Natural persons are human beings, while artificial persons refer to organizations such as partnerships, associations, and other corporations. Therefore, a corporation can be a shareholder of another corporation. Note that there are certain types of corporations which require that a minimum percentage of shares of stock be owned by Filipinos. An example is a mass media entity which must be 100% owned by Filipinos. Another example is an advertising corporation, which must be at least 70% owned by Filipinos. Can you tell me who the first shareholders of the corporation are? We discussed it a while ago. That's right, they are the incorporators. Remember that the incorporators are the ones who form the corporation. Do you recall that an incorporator must be an owner of at least one share of stock? Very good. Therefore, incorporators are the first and original shareholders of the corporation. Now, since the authorized capital stock can be divided into as many shares as the corporation prefers, shares can be offered to a large number of investors. If there are thousands, millions, or more shares, then the corporation can raise capital from thousands, millions, or more investors. Also, should the corporation need to sell more shares to be able to generate funds, it can increase its authorized capital stock by seeking approval from the SEC. Corporations thus have a remarkable ability to obtain huge amounts of capital compared to other types of business organizations such as sole proprietorships and partnerships. This makes it easier for corporations to fund large projects and expand operations. We already know that a shareholder is an owner of the corporation. So what now? What does it mean to be an owner? What are the rights of a shareholder? Being an owner of the corporation, a shareholder enjoys various rights, including the following. To vote. Shareholders meet regularly once a year. In addition, whenever it becomes necessary, they may also conduct special meetings anytime. During these meetings, shareholders decide on major matters affecting the corporation, such as increasing or decreasing the life of the corporation, increasing or decreasing the authorized capital, investing the corporation's funds in another business, and mergers and acquisitions where the corporation combines with another company. The shareholders also elect the board of directors. We will have a separate discussion on the corporate life and the board of directors in a short while. To dividends. This is the right to share in the corporation's profitability. Profits of the corporation may be declared for distribution to the shareholders. Such profits for distribution are called dividends. To the net assets of the corporation. When the corporation ceases to operate, it undergoes the process of liquidation where its assets are sold to pay off creditors. The balance of the assets will be distributed to the shareholders. We will have a separate discussion on corporate liquidation. The extent of the shareholder's rights is determined by the percentage of his ownership in the corporation. This is the proportion of the shares of stock to the total number of shares of stocks held by all of the corporation's stockholders. For example, if shareholder A owns 10,000 shares of stock and all the other shareholders own 90,000 shares of stock, there are 100,000 total shares of stock owned by all stockholders of the corporation. We divide A's 10,000 shares by the 100,000 total shares to get 10%. This means that shareholder A has 10% ownership of the corporation. Therefore, when the corporation declares dividends out of its profits, A gets 10%. When the corporation is liquidated, A gets 10% of the net assets. A can also vote and influence the decisions of the corporation to the extent of his 10% shareholdings. Have you heard of the terms majority shareholder and minority shareholder? These terms pertain to the percentage of ownership in the corporation. A majority shareholder owns more than 50% of the shares. The remaining shares are owned by the minority shareholder. Let us talk about two interesting features of shares of stock. You have learned from the previous topics that a corporation is a separate juridical personality. It is an entity in itself, separate and distinct from its shareholders. So, when a corporation contracts debts in the course of its operations, such debts are the debts of the corporation and not of the shareholders. Therefore, the debts will be paid out from the properties of the corporation and not from the properties of the shareholders. This means that the corporation's creditors can only go after the amount of capital invested by the shareholders in the corporation. They cannot go after the personal properties of the shareholders. The reason is that the capital invested by the shareholders already become properties of the corporation and not of the shareholders. Let us have an example. Shareholder A buys 100,000 shares of stock for the par value of 1 peso per share. He pays for the shares either in cash or property, such as land and building. So A invested capital in the corporation in the form of cash or property amounting to 100,000 pesos. In return, A becomes an owner of 100,000 shares of stock. This 100,000 pesos capital paid by A becomes the property of the corporation. This 100,000 pesos capital will be used to pay the debts of the corporation. Even if the corporation's properties will not be enough to pay its debts, the creditors of the corporation cannot go after the personal properties of the shareholders. In other words, the liability of the shareholders for the corporation's debts is limited to the amount of capital they invested in the corporation. This is the doctrine of limited liability in corporations. This characteristic makes the corporation more attractive to investors as compared to sole proprietorships and partnerships where the owners are liable up to their personal properties. Another important feature of shares of stock is transferability. A shareholder can transfer his ownership in the corporation by selling, donating, or transferring in any other way shares of stock to another. The transfer does not disrupt the operations of the corporation. The corporation simply records the transfer and the personal information of the new owner. Also, the shareholder does not need to get the consent of the corporation nor of the other shareholders for him to make the transfer. So, when a shareholder needs personal funds, it is easy for him to sell his shares of stock. In contrast, in a partnership, a partner has to get the approval of all the other partners before he can transfer his interest in the partner. We already know that a corporation is owned by the shareholders. We also know that the shareholders decide on major issues affecting the corporation. But how about the day-to-day management of the corporation? Is the corporation managed by the shareholders in the same way that sole proprietorships and partnerships are managed by the owners? A corporation can have numerous shareholders who may be scattered in different parts of the world, may not know each other, and may be unfamiliar with the business. So, although shareholders decide on major matters affecting the corporation, it is difficult for them to manage the daily operations of the business. What the shareholders do is choose a group of individuals who will handle the actual management of the corporation. These individuals are the directors and the officers of the corporation. Let us talk first about the directors of the corporation. Do you recall that among the rights of the shareholders is the right to elect directors? Very good. The shareholders hold an election to choose from among them the persons who will manage the corporation. These persons are called the directors of the corporation. As a group, they are referred to as the board of directors or simply the board. The individual directors are also called the members of the board. What does the board do? What are its powers? The power to control the corporation is concentrated in the board. It is the governing body of the corporation. The board sets the policies and the broad goals and direction of the corporation. The board conducts the business of the corporation. So, all acts of the corporation must be made by the board or authorized by the board. For example, contracts entered into by the corporation must be approved by the board. In the absence of authority from the board, no person, not even the shareholders, can act for the corporation. Remember that the directors are chosen by the shareholders to represent them. Thus, acts of the board are acts of the shareholders. The shareholders cannot just cancel or reverse the acts of the board. If the shareholders are not satisfied with the performance of the board, they can replace its members through an election. Remember, however, that there is a certain type of act that the board cannot perform. Do you remember our discussion on major matters affecting the corporation? Examples of these are increasing or decreasing the life of the corporation, increasing or decreasing the authorized capital, investing the corporate funds in another business, and mergers and acquisitions. Who has the authority to decide and act on these matters? That's right, it is the entire group of shareholders who decide and act on these matters. The board acts together as a body and not individually or separately, so the directors have no individual power to act for the corporation. The board makes decisions by voting. For this purpose, the board meets regularly, usually once a month. The board may also meet at any time when necessary. Remember that shareholders meet regularly only once a year. Now, who can become members of the board? All directors must own at least one share of stock. In other words, directors must be shareholders. Remember that directors are chosen by the shareholders from among themselves and that they represent the shareholders. Also, directors must be natural persons. This is because only natural persons can perform acts of management. You may recall that artificial persons, such as corporations, partnerships, associations, can become shareholders. However, they cannot become directors. Does this mean that they cannot be represented in the board? The answer is, they can. The shareholders may elect a corporate shareholder to the board. This corporate shareholder may then designate a natural person as its representative in the board. How many members can the board have? The number of directors can vary from 1 to 15, with 15 being the maximum. Only a one-person corporation can have one director. We will have a special discussion on one-person corporations. How long does a member of the board hold office? Directors hold office for 1 year. Remember that shareholders meet regularly once a year. During those meetings, the shareholders elect the new member of the board who will replace the one whose term has ended. Let us now move on to the officers of the corporation. You have learned that the board is the governing body of the corporation and that it sets the policy and directs the overall direction of the business. But who manages the day-to-day operations of the corporation? Is that also a function of the board? Remember that the board usually meets only once a month. The tasks of actual management and carrying on the details of business operations are delegated by the board to a group of individuals called the corporate officers. The board sets the policy and directs the overall direction. The corporate officers carry out and implement these policies and run the day-to-day operations of the corporation. The corporate officers are elected by the board. They are supervised by the board. Their compensation is also determined by the board. Who are the corporate officers? The president. The president must be a director. You have learned that directors are required to be shareholders, so the president must be a shareholder. The treasurer. The treasurer must be residing in the Philippines. The secretary. The secretary must be a Filipino. He must also reside in the Philippines. The bylaws may provide for other corporate officer positions such as Vice President for Operations, Vice President for Finance, and General Manager. The specific functions of each corporate officer are provided for in the bylaws. However, the President cannot act as Secretary and vice versa. The President cannot also act as Treasurer and vice versa. These are incompatible positions and must be separated to ensure effective monitoring of each other's functions. Notice that the Secretary and Treasurer can be the same person. In the case of a one-person corporation, the single shareholder can be both the President and Treasurer. However, he cannot be both President and Secretary. The corporate officers hold office for 1 year. However, a different period may be fixed in the bylaws. Note, though, that it has been a long-standing policy of the SEC not to allow a provision in the bylaws providing for a lifetime or indefinite term of corporate officers. This is to avoid possible abuse of power. Such provisions bind the hands of future boards of directors and deprive other members of the corporation the opportunity to become officers.